welcome to this slightly delayed overview and scrutiny committee meeting on Thursday 12th of August 2021. Apologies, we've had some technical issues. My name is Councillor Vanessa Bell and I'm the chairman of this committee. Before we commence the business of the meeting, there are a few housekeeping issues to run through. Members, the setup for the meeting has been designed to mitigate for COVID. Therefore, can I ask all present to work to the protocols agreed at Council on 29th of April 2021 in the interest of member and officer safety. We're streaming this meeting live as well as recording, and by being present in the meeting, you are giving your consent to being recorded. Members and officers, during each item, please put your hand up to indicate if you wish to speak. I will then invite you at the appropriate time. When invited to speak, please remove your mask, put on your visor. I don't think do we need to put on visors? I'm not entirely sure, I think. Do what you feel comfortable with, members, as long as you're following the protocols. Please reference a page or paragraph number when referring to the agenda papers. Keep your contributions as clear and concise as possible and ensure your microphones remain off when not speaking. Finally, can I draw your attention to the notices on the agenda papers regarding the different levels within the chamber that I've already fallen up tonight, and advise that the fire exit is the door behind the top table. That brings us on to item 2, apologies for absence. Tara, please may I have the apologies?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies been received from Councillor Jewick and Councillor Helm. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 3, minutes. It is recommended that the minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of April 2021, found on pages 5 to 8, are approved as a true and accurate record. I so move. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Mays. Does anybody wish to raise any matters of accuracy, or are we happy with those? I'll take that as that we're happy. Are we happy to agree by assent? Super, thank you very much. Item 4, declarations of interest. To disclose the existence and nature of any disclosable pecuniary interests, other pecuniary interests or non-pecuniary interests relating to items of business on the agenda, having regard to paragraphs 6 to 8 inclusive of the Code of Conduct for members. Do I have any members? Councillor Mr Stan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not a member of this committee, but I have requested if I would like to speak or ask the questions depending on how the debate goes. So I'd just like to declare that I'm a Essex County Councillor, which I don't think involves anything on tonight's agenda, and I'm also the leader of this council. Thank you
Very much, Councillor Stan. Members are reminded that they're also required to disclose any such interests as soon as they become aware, should the need arise throughout the meeting. Item 5, public participation. I can advise that we have not received any submissions from members of the public. At least if we have, I've not been told, so I take that as a not. Okay, that brings us on to agenda item 6, which is the full report of the Transformation Board. So this can be found on pages 9 to 26. And I will turn to Ms Hughes to present the item. Thank you.
Good evening, members. Following on from the 15th of April, where the committee considered an interim report on the matter of transformation, learning from what we have done, the full report is now presented to committee for consideration. The 2 questions that were agreed to be addressed when the item was originally added to the committee work plan in January 2021 were: did we achieve the outcomes of transformation, both at a high level and the finer detail, which is presented throughout the report? And for resident and customer experience and council reputation, what is the effect of transformation? This question specifically is highlighted in section 4 of Appendix A, where there is a section of the table that has customer and cost implications. In the April committee, where the draft report was presented, members also asked for further detail on the governance and reporting of risks surrounding the programme. That's been included in the background of section A, the background section of Appendix A, which is found on page 11 of your full agenda pack, and examples shown in pages 23 to 25. Page 19 also shows the initial implications that were signed off by members when full council agreed the blueprint document in 2018, which was also requested. The interim report still required financial detail of the programme, which would have included projected and actual finances. This is now set out in pages 20 to 22 of your agenda pack. Factoring in these additional areas of information, as well as the summary table in pages 13 to 19, which analyses the original work packages, the agreed outcomes, and an analysis to which extent they were achieved, we've been able to identify areas of learning from the transformation programme, which is in section 2 of the appendix. The key highlights from this are that transformation work is an ongoing and iterative process, and although there were large organisational changes between when the blueprint was signed off in 2018 and when the structure went live in 2019 October, work is still ongoing with some of the work packages in areas like ICT and process improvement. That when the revised structure went live in October 2019, because not all of the work packages were complete, we couldn't fully underpin the new structure. The impact of so few staff being job matched and the higher than expected turnover had an immediate impact on project delivery and an impact on staff well-being, which has been reflected in staff feedback. And a delay in the phones implementation had an impact on customer experience at the time. Due to the speed and the nature of the process, the training and the outcomes were delivered by consultancy staff, which has also meant that internal staff have taken time to build knowledge and become custodians of what was set out. Financially, there is also a staffing variance of 12% to what was set out in the original blueprint. This is made up of posts having to go back in where the structure felt too lean, and additional resource requirements of COVID. There were also savings targets that were identified as unachievable to the tune of £337,000, and this has been factored in as part of the medium-term financial strategy work. As a positive point of learning, updates to working practices in culture and change help put the organisation in a good place to respond to challenges of COVID-19, such as a shift to online working. Some of these issues have already been picked up and addressed operationally. For example, resource gaps have been addressed in the operational model, and staffing structures have been adjusted accordingly. And a programme of continual process improvement work has been put in place for the organisation. The leadership team have worked to address gaps and support staff issues like well-being, and in more recent staff surveys we have seen improvements in staff feedback. Section 3 of the appendix on page 12 of your full agenda pack identifies areas where more work could be done to build on transformation, and members are invited to reflect on both the list provided and the information set out in the report generally, and advise if they would like to recommend any actions to council or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, members, I'm going to go over to you for a debate. So, has anyone got anything they would like to say? Councillor Mays.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. With regard to the high turnover of staff, has that actually slowed since transformation has pretty much come to a conclusion? I know there are areas that are still being worked on, but has this turnover of staff slowed? And if so, do you believe that that will stay as such, and therefore the culture is good and all is well within the council as a whole? Thank you.
So staff turnover and retention of staff was added to the corporate risk register and reported through performance governance and audit, and that has reduced in risk rating on the corporate risk register. I think it was the last performance governance and audit committee that went through, but yeah, the scoring has come down, so we see it as less of a corporate risk than what we did.
Thank you.
Could I come back, Mr. Chairman?
By all means.
Thanks,
So even though you called me Misty,
I
yes, I'll let you
apologise for
cancel.
that. Madam Chairman. Now I've forgotten what I was going to ask. I'll come back, thank you.
I'm sorry. Any other members? If not, then I will invite Councillor Stamp to speak, but no, Councillor Stamp likes to let other members go before her, and certainly committee members. Have you remembered, Councillor Mays?
No, I haven't, but I was going to just come back on the unachievable 300,000. That's no small amount of saving. Why do we think that that was unachievable? Why was it even included in the transformation in the first place? And at what point was that actually identified as being unachievable? Thank you.
Excellent question. It's you.
So the identification happened as part of the medium-term financial strategy when they were reviewing the budgets. But there was an overall pot, so the further savings actually amounted to an estimated, we expected to save 891,000. That was made up of things like commercial income, strategic reductions in some of the, stopping some of the things that we were doing, and also sort of corporate budgets. But percentage-wise, compared to this staffing, obviously that was a much smaller percent of the savings, and the 337,000 is what's been identified as unachievable, which is a mix of those commercial pots and those assumed strategic savings.
If I'll allow you to come back, then I'm going to Councillor Bassinger.
Yep. All I was going to ask was how will that affect, do you think, the financial budgeting for 21-22 and 22-23? Thank you.
I believe finance, I'm not a finance expert, but I believe finance have accounted for it already. So I think that has already come forward as part of the medium-term financial strategy reporting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bassinger.
Thank you. I was just wondering, looking at this, it says the future modelling predicted staff savings of 1 million. I mean, how did you ever get to future? I mean, who modelled that? Whoever thought it was £1 million of savings? Where did that come from?
So the modelling and the assumptions were put together by Ignite, the consultants. And obviously the assumption was the 1 million, but the savings that have been able to been achieved is 882,940. So the variance is 12% on what was modelled.
Thank you. Although we're all very aware that we are going to have to put stuff back in some places, because, as mentioned, we have become too lean in some areas, and there will be more. Yes, Councillor Bassinger.
I mean, looking at that modelling and paying Unite to give us that modelling, would we say that that was probably false or a waste of money? Yeah, it just seems ridiculous when it's a modelling from a company or consultants and then be completely wrong.
I'm not sure I can entirely comment on that, although I'm not sure that those expertise sat within the organisation at the time to be able to do that modelling exercise.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go to you in a second, Councillor Skins, but after I've put my oar in, which is that, personally I don't think it was successful, but, that's my view, and later on I'll come on to the things that I think are important, the most important things, which are, I won't use the word customer because that implies choice, resident satisfaction and staff satisfaction, but we'll come to that later on. Councillor Skins.
Yes, it just occurs to me listening to this that we're 12% out, but I'm assuming the Ignite proposals were a bit of a menu from which we chose what we wanted, so we cut what we wanted to cut, got as close to it as we could, and decided not to cut as much staff. Does that make sense? Is that what happened?
So the 12% variance is where we've had to add posts back in. So the initial restructure happened, and the set out of the structure accounted for that 1 million, but we've had to add additional posts back into the organisation since then.
So if I could come back, that basically means that their predictions for being able to run the council on less staff just proved to be impractical, but they were about 90% right, is ultimately, or 88% right. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Bassinger again.
No, I was just more against Councillor Skinner just said. Leave it.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to speak? I will go to Councillor Stamp then, please.
Chairman, thank you. I think I should wait until you say your bit, because you're the chairman of the committee, and I know you had quite valid views on the transformation, and I don't think it would be fair for me to actually step in before you've said yours. I have got some points to make, but I'm sure you may cover them, and I'm not one to steal anybody's thunder, so thank you. I'll wait.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stamp. I mean, my concerns, yes, because this is looking, we're just talking about savings. I mean, my concerns are services to our residents, which I believe have suffered enormously through transformation, not least through the digitalisation of the council. I believe we're still not open for face-to-face people to come in, and you know, the lack of consideration for the fact that we do have quite an ageing population, but more importantly, there are large swathes of the district where you cannot get internet. So there are large numbers of residents who simply cannot access council services because they have been digitised. And my second point was around staff satisfaction. We've touched briefly on recruitment and retention. I was horrified to see that even with a 19% increase, the level of staff satisfaction is still so low. I'm not so concerned. I've looked into resident satisfaction with councils, and generally speaking across the country, satisfaction levels aren't enormously high, but certainly with in terms of staff satisfaction, I mean, I will mention perhaps now the recommendations that I intend to make, and we can perhaps discuss those. So I'll be looking at staff satisfaction surveys being carried out half yearly with a target of 90% to improve retention and appointments. Resident satisfaction surveys carried out annually with a target of 75% positive. An overhaul and revamp of the website, making navigation easier for members of the public, and also looking at the use of language and plain English. It's really difficult to navigate, and there's lots of good information, really good information about the final item on this agenda that you can't necessarily find because the navigation is challenging, shall we say. I think we still need to identify areas of organisational deficiency, including where there are already staff shortages. We really need to promote a balanced resident journey, incorporating digital and face-to-face experiences. And lastly, overall, really, ensure that this agile working is always focused on customer need, balanced with health and well-being of staff, and taking away the focus from savings. We are here to provide a service to our residents, and that is our primary function. So I will now hand over to you, Councillor Stamp.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Ms Hughes. I have some actual concerns. I'd like to actually congratulate the team members, the CLT, who actually had to deliver this initially. Many of us who are elected now weren't around when the decision was taken to implement the transformation. We understand why it was felt it was necessary, but I really do question the actual effectiveness. And now, Madam Chair and members, I think we're all actually seeing where the gaps are rising. We only have to look at some issues that are going on in the council. Last year we know was totally unfounded because we had a pandemic. We know that staff had to, even though they were going through the biggest transformation, many lost their jobs. Many lost their livelihoods. I mean, I was absolutely astounded, Madam Chair, about the cost of the redundancy figures. I would love to know how many staff we had and how many we have ended up with. And I would have liked to see the model, the matrix that decided on how we could deliver the services we're expected to deliver, not only by law, but our expectation from our residents or customers, whichever way around you want to say that we refer to the public we're actually here to serve. I'm not going to knock anything that was done previously. What I want to do, though, is look forward, and I think we have to be realistic. We haven't saved the money, I feel, Madam Chair, and I'm quite willing to be corrected if I'm wrong. We haven't made the savings that we were told we would make. I'd love to know actually the true cost of how much it cost us. In our own office at time, as well as Ignite when they came in, the package must have been presented. You are going to save this amount of money. And I would have really hoped, I don't know if they did, there was some comeback if we failed, because this was a model that was agreed and approved at this council that they accepted. Now, surely, if you agree a contract or a model, there is some clause behind that says if you have failed, these are the things that you will have to do, whether you can give us 100 or 200,000 back. Because I am seeing, Madam Chair and members, the repercussions of this now, and I think it is having an effect on all our staff who's had to work through the pandemic. They're all having to job share, they had to be trained in their new jobs. If you listen to the presentation, which was excellent by Ms Hughes, it was referred to the contractors who actually did the work, and then our teams had to be retrained in their roles. That all takes time and has a massive effect on people's mental health. Now, I'm the great believer in supporting staff, and I think many members in here know I champion and hopefully look after our staff in this, in our council, because they are the backbone of what makes us the standard we are. I don't want to be negative, Madam Chair, but I have seen the recommendations that are going to come from the Chair. But I do have concerns that I think it was needed. Certain areas, ICT, etc., we've done well because we managed to go through the pandemic. And if we hadn't have upgraded, there's no way we could have been on course and ahead of the many other councils in that respect. But as I've said for the third time now, it is now showing that we've got gaps. And we are going to have to come back to this council and our taxpayers to ask for more money for our mid-financial term and next year, because we cannot provide the services. Now, I don't know what other members feel, but I particularly don't want to cut services, but sometimes you have to make a choice, and we're going to have to make a choice as a council if we don't agree to these either a restructure or agreeing with some more staff, Madam Chair. I think I better stop because I feel quite passionate about this, because we all want this council to do well and we want to provide a first-class service. And I'm afraid I don't see how we can do that at the moment with what we've got, Madam Chair. No questions, it's more of a statement. I don't want to say anything because I think Ms Hughes and the team have worked very hard behind the scenes to produce an excellent, very informative report. But one question, so I'm actually going back on myself. I'm interested in the number of staff. I'm really interested in the number of staff we had running the same services before transformation and what we've got now. If that you don't come now, if that could be given to all members, Madam Chair, if that's all right with you.
That would be useful,
Thank you for allowing me to speak, Madam Chair.
You're welcome, Councillor Stamp, and thank you for your very valid points. Would that be feasible?
Yeah, I don't have those figures to hand now, but we can certainly,
just to be circulated. Thank you, and Councillor Stamp, I share your concerns. I really do. I question whether at this point in time the council is fit for purpose with, I know that's a big statement, but in some areas, I hasten to add, there are things we're doing exceptionally well. I'll come to you in a second, Councillor. There are things we're doing exceptionally well, and I'm quite excited actually about, the last item on the agenda today, because I don't want to give anything away, but there are areas in which we're not doing as well as we should be. So yes, Councillor Stamp, then Councillor Mays, then Councillor Bassett.
Thank you. I'd just like to come back. The areas that we are doing really well at, and the staff have worked extremely hard. But like I said, we are fit for purpose, Madam Chair. We provide excellent services.
I do like to be over dramatic, Councillor Stamp.
We provide, and I do think a customer service, and lots of our officers work extremely hard, and they do reply. The majority of the time do reply as soon as possible, Madam Chair. And I've also done a Carly Mays, Councillor Mays, because I've forgotten the point I was going to make, so I reserve the right to come
That
back.
allows me just to slip in there, Councillor Stamp, with my statement was absolutely no slur on our officers, who are absolutely fantastic, and I cannot thank officers enough for the support, certainly that I've received, and the work that they've put in. It's the structure that in some places is problematic. So I must clarify that absolutely no criticism of our officers whatsoever. Councillor Mays, then Councillor Bassinger.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say that your staff are the most important asset in a business, whatever that is. And I do feel very strongly that Ignite failed to recognise this during their transformation, and we are now left with the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree. I think staff were treated as commodities, really, and I would absolutely agree with that. So thank you. Councillor Bassinger.
Thank you. I mean, just as a silly thing, really, I mean, would it not be possible to do a sort of reverse modelling? So as where Unite have done a modelling, projecting how much we could save and whatever. But a reverse modelling, maybe going back historically to, as Councillor Stamp said, how many staff we had to provide the services that we're still trying to provide with less staff, and how much it would cost to put all those people back. So a sort of reversed thought pattern. So for this council now, as we think maybe it needs more staff, which I think it does, exactly we could work out how much of a budget we would need to do that. Perhaps that sort of modelling might be interesting.
Big piece of work, Councillor Bassinger.
Off the top of my head, thank you.
I don't know, Ms Hughes, whether that would be feasible.
I suppose the answer is that the variance between staffing figures is that 882,000, to go right back to when. But I think if I get the figure over around FTEs before transformation and FTEs now, that will give you a better idea.
Thank you.
I may come back. I mean, I think communicating this to the public, because I think one of the main problems we face is when we ask for a little more budget from people, they think we're just sort of, getting rid of it. But I think if we can explain or get it out to them that to actually provide the service that we used to have, it will cost this much money. It's more of a realistic, it's something people I think can get hold of better when you realise exactly where your money's going, rather than sort of to odd schemes and whatever. But when they know it's about their services, I think we have a better chance of actually then going out there to the residents once again and saying, look, we need another whatever, just to get everything back to the way it was.
Thank you. Councillor Skeens, then Councillor Stamp.
It's always a problem, isn't it, presenting things like the wage bill, the massive wage bill, to the public, because the public go, well, you don't need all those people, and it's just a gravy train, and they come up with these phrases because they don't understand how hard it is to run a council and all the difficulties. It seems to me that transformation has done what it can to save £1 million, but I think the problem was it sort of started from a point when we were pretty cut to the bone anyway. But on the other hand, the council has financial problems. It's got to do something. So we're going to, but of course, massive pressure has come upon officers being asked, frankly, to do too much. And my heart goes out to them. And let's hope we can find a clever solution that alleviates that pressure while still maintaining the best possible services.
Thank you, Councillor Skeens. Councillor Stamp.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I think we've got to be realistic. We have, it has gone this far, but we have got to actually look at going forward and to make some changes. I mean, if you actually look into the transformation, there's only one part that I was slightly concerned about. Was some of it was what I call the balancing was commercial. Yeah, we were supposed to be looking at commercial projects, how we could bring an income in. But because I personally don't feel that the transformation actually allocated enough staff or an area that could actually make some inroads into providing an income for the council, it was too thin. I think there was one commercial manager and the commercial manager has been totally run off their feet because of having to do things within COVID. And I'm not just singling that manager out. I know many managers has had to multitask and go to support other members, because we have just been too thin on the ground. But saying that, we are where we are. I can't remember who says that, but I know it's a well-known saying. We are where we are. We've got to look forward, and hopefully the council will be able to bring something forward soon to actually make some recommendations to adjust the structure as and when that we feel we can. But what I would like to do also, Madam Chair, is to thank the people behind the scenes, like, you know, Tara, you know, the committee services, those sorts of people who actually appear day in, day out, the IT, people like that don't always get a mention, for actually keeping us running on the rail tracks, and also the directors. We all know we get a lot of bad publicity and get accused of all sorts of things, left, right and centre. But I do feel that they have done extremely well for the transformation. That was, after all, put on them by members. It was a member decision, not an officer decision. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And yeah, absolutely, without committee services and IT, I would appear as even more of a buffoon than I already do. So thank you guys for your support. Councillor Mays.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You put forward some recommendations. I would like to actually propose that we adopt those recommendations going forward in some form. I don't know how you would want to actually record those.
Thank
but
you.
I
I would like
that.
to second that, or propose, whichever way round we did that. So I will propose those recommendations. That's a seconding from Councillor Mays. So I then propose that we close off the item with those recommendations. Now I'll go over the recommendations again. They were to carry out staff satisfaction surveys half yearly with a target of 90% satisfaction, resident satisfactions annually with a target of 75% satisfaction, using a variety of methods, overhaul and revamp of a website. I believe this work's already going on, so I don't think we're putting any extra work on officers, which I'm very loath to do, including relevance of information provided. Identify areas of organisational deficiency, including where there are already staff shortages. Promote a balanced customer journey, incorporating digital and face-to-face experience, and ensure that agile working is always focused on customer need, balanced with health and well-being of staff. Members, are we happy to agree that by assent, or do we, Councillor Stamp?
Sorry, I was just nuttering while you were speaking, so apologies for that. I just wondered why, and if somebody could tell me why that this resident satisfaction surveys target 75%. I personally think the residents, we should be working as to the highest as what we possibly can. But I've been assured there are reasons behind that, and if somebody would like to, I'm sure Miss Hughes can actually fill not just me in, but the residents, because it does look as though we're shortchanging them. So an explanation would be fantastic.
No, I'm unwilling to dump this on Ms Hughes, although I'm happy to. But I've had a look at surveys across the board, resident satisfaction in local authorities across the country, and it is generally low. And I think I will hand over to you in a minute, but my personal view is that is to do with who we are and what we do. And it will be things like my bins don't get collected, there aren't enough dog poo bins, that we are always, as councils, going to be the bad guy in some areas. I don't know, Cheryl, if you can help out further with that.
Yeah, I've been involved in resident surveys for many years, and I think 60% is usually a good number in terms of resident satisfaction. But what we could do with that particular recommendation, rather than actually have a number, is have that resident satisfaction is higher than average in Essex, and then benchmark ourselves against other organisations as well, and look into, you know, if you sort of want to aim.
I'm happy to make that amendment. Councillor Stamp.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I take on board what you've said, but would they be the detail behind it? So, for example, Councillor Bell, the chairman's just turned around and said that it's the bin collection. We know recently my inbox has been full about bin collections because of what's been going on recently, which is unfortunate. But obviously people are going down sick with COVID. It's a fact of life, whether people like it or not. People are still getting COVID, and people are very poorly with it. So would that information be readily available? Say, for example, we are at 60% complaints instead of the 75 or whatever, that it says, well, you've got 80% or 90% complaints about bin collection, but we've got, I don't know, 75% who actually compliment us on something else. So we've got a balance.
You mean, a breakdown?
Yes, please, to drill down and give the information at the back.
That possible?
Yep, so the resident survey that we run has about 40 questions in it. So what we do is we drill down analysis. So of the people that were satisfied with our services, we ask them what they were satisfied about. So we do have, and we create a full 30-page report when we do the analysis of the resident survey.
Councillor Skews?
Yes, 40 questions. What sort of response rate do we get? How many people fill in 40 questions?
The last one was 303 responses that we got.
Out of how many taxpayers?
68,000?
Yeah, so out of all of the households in Malden, but that's actually quite a good number. So when I worked at Colchester doing resident surveys, we might get 1,000 returned, but that was when we sent out postal surveys with a free post envelope. It's quite hard to get residents to engage with resident surveys historically.
Through the chair, if I may come back, one reason why it might be hard is 40 questions. Now, of course, I know you want lots of detail, but you're getting lots of detail from less people who are more committed. Maybe there's a case for the upcoming working group to have a look at, or to have a look at how we can make those surveys just a little bit more likely to be answered, just as a thought.
Thank you, Councillor Skews. I mean, I've always been taught that 30% is the lowest statistically relevant number. So
But we're not under...
failed miserably on that.
Yeah, what is the percentage, if you don't mind, through the chair?
It was about 0.000 something, isn't it, I think?
Yes.
So that's moving on. So members, are we happy to close this item with the recommendations? And can we agree that by assent, members? Agreed. Thank you very much, and thank you again to officers, particularly Cheryl, for the enormous amount of work that has been put into this. So many, many thanks for that. Okay, moving on swiftly to item 7, which is the working group of overview and scrutiny. Now, just for the benefit of our new member, we have the working group. The role of the working group is to act as a filter, to triage items that are put forward to the overview and scrutiny committee. So the forms will come in from members, and the working group will meet and discuss those, and then a decision will be made. I mean, it might just be that they're actually a request for information rather than a scrutiny item, in which case the information requested can be provided. It might be decided that it's not appropriate for scrutiny, or the item might then be agreed to go forward to the scrutiny committee. So that's the role of the working group. Now, the working group does not have to be politically balanced, but I like it to be politically balanced if possible, because I think it's fair. Can I appoint myself from the chair, Tara? I can nominate myself, hurrah for me. Councillor Skews.
It may affect people wanting to work on the group, but is it possible that working group meetings could be virtual, since they're not public?
No, because decisions are made, I believe, and that am I right in thinking that decision-making meetings have to be in person?
I think they can.
Are we able to, hurrah and huzzah, they can be. Brilliant, I
great.
apologise, yes they can.
And so will they? I mean, will we?
Yes,
we will.
Yes, we will, Councillor Skews. So, from the chair, I would like to nominate myself, Councillor Mays, Councillor Anne Beale, and Councillor, no? Councillor Hubner, would you like to have a crack at it? Yes, I would. Excellent. And Councillor Jewick, but he's not here, so I don't really know where we stand. Councillor Skeens, were you proposing an interest there?
Yes. If you want to nominate me, I'll attend if it's virtual. Do my best.
Councillor Mays,
I'll second those.
you'll second all of them? Can we agree that by assent then? Yes, I am, because I don't feel it's fair to nominate someone in their absence, Tara, so, I mean, I would like, well, it'll be in the minutes that we attempted to be politically balanced, but with neither of the non-aligned members here, it's been slightly difficult to do so. Super, we have a working group. Many thanks, everyone. I do apologise for my absolute ignorance in terms of how that works. So, moving on to appointment of representatives on liaison committees. This can be found on pages 31 to 32. So, to remind members of the existing representatives on liaison committees and for new appointments to be made for the municipal year to May 2022. So, yes, pages 31 to 32. So, I would like from the Chair to nominate Councillor Mays to the Health Overview Policy and Scrutiny Committee for the municipal year to May 2022. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Bassinger and Councillor Huebner. Thank you very much. Okay, many thanks for that. Oh, yes, was that agreed? Sorry. Agreed?
Well, so you want to speak?
Yes.
I did want to speak. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Skeens. Can we just thank the councillor who has actually now not going to be on there anymore, Councillor Beale. He's done a lot for this council, and I think it should be acknowledged and recognised all the years of hard service he's put on this council. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, Councillor Brian Beale, thank you very much. I'm not sure you actually had to do anything very much on that committee.
Chairman, you didn't have
thanks, Councillor.
Chairman, you didn't have to say that. You could have just taken it. You didn't have to say you didn't attend any meetings.
I just want to know. Yes, absolutely. Councillor Beale has, I dread to think how many meetings Councillor Beale has attended over his 32 years of service. But brilliant. So that was agreed, I believe. Whizzing on through. Which brings us on to item number 9, debt recovery work plan. This can be found on pages 27 to 28. And I move to Mrs. Green, who has a presentation for us. So over to you, Mrs. Green.
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, members. I have a presentation for you this evening, which I hope will address some of the areas that have been identified in the previous scrutiny item. As members will know, this original piece of scrutiny was agreed back in January, and you had an updated report in April. But there were clearly still a number of areas that members felt weren't covered. So what I'm going to do tonight, members, is actually to do a presentation to you which will take you through the whole debt recovery process, which I hope will not only help with a wider understanding of the process, but will give you the reassurance about our internal processes, and will also back this up with some data which I hope you will find useful. Thanks, Tara. Thank you. So the whole debt recovery process is actually laid down in legislation, so it's not something that as a local authority we have very much discretion over, but we do have a discretion as to how we act within that legislation, and what are we doing today is to talk around what we do over and above what the legislation requires us to do. So to start with, I'd just like to go over the initial process. So as members will know, every resident will receive a bill every year. It's also known as a demand notice. That's what the legislation calls it. But it's for all purposes, it's what everybody refers to as a bill. Everybody's entitled to at least one reminder if they default on their payments, and they will also receive a final notice. If the payment isn't made, then that can result in a summons being issued, and then if the payment isn't made, then it will proceed to court to request a liability order. Once we get that liability order, that gives the authority some very wide-ranging powers. All of these powers are given to us as part of the liability order, so we don't have to go back to court to use any of these. They are all within our own gift. And that's really important because we need to have very good processes in place to ensure that those powers that we're given by the court are used proportionately and reasonably and fairly. So the first piece of authority we have is we can request information about a debtor's income. Now, the debtor is actually obliged legally to provide that information to us. That often doesn't happen, but the law requires that they are required to give that to us. We have the power to give an attachment of earnings order, so we can serve a notice on an employer to request that the money is taken out of that person's wages. If they're receiving benefits, we can request the Department of Work and Pensions to take money out of that person's benefit. For members, if you are in receipt of a member's allowance, we have the right to take money out of your member's allowance. We can send in what is previously called a bailiff, it's now an enforcement agent, to actually remove goods to the value of the debt. We can place a charging order on a property, so that gives us a legal interest in that property. We can also instigate bankruptcy and winding up procedures, and ultimately we can request the court to commit that person to prison. So that's why, you know, we are custodians of a lot of responsibility, and we do take that very, very seriously. So that's just to giving you the background of the legislation. Thanks, Tara. So the way in which we ensure that we are having a very careful regard to how we use those powers is we have a corporate debt strategy, and that doesn't cover just council tax, that covers business rates and other debts that are owed to the council. The basis of that strategy is very much a focus on early intervention. What we do know is if we can start to work with the resident, the customer very early on, then we're able to avoid a lot of problems. So that's very much the focus of the strategy and very much the focus of what our day-to-day work is. We will always make arrangements rather than take enforcement action. So we make many, many arrangements, sometimes multiple arrangements with customers, because that's what we want to do. We don't want to take enforcement action, so that's very much the focus. Through every contact with customers, we'll be looking to identify if we have any vulnerable customers, and that's set out in the cadet strategy, identifying the sort of things that the staff need to look out for when we're dealing with them, and flagging up whether or not we need to take additional steps with those customers. Right the way through the process, we'll always support our customers, so it's very much a looking to see what we can do to help the customers, and we have a very holistic approach. The council, if somebody has got a council tax debt, they've probably got other debts as well, probably rent, perhaps fuel bills. So we aren't looking at it from the single point of view of that person owes us council tax and that's all we're concerned with. It's very much a very holistic approach. And we put in place additional controls for the most severe forms of enforcement action, so things like a bailiff or winding up, charging orders. They're all things that require to be sanctioned by a manager, and there would need to be a business case put forward for the most extreme forms of action. No officer would be able to, for example, start a winding up procedure or bankruptcy or a charging order without going through a very detailed process and really being able to justify that action. Thanks, Tara. The additional support that we give residents, as I've already mentioned, the big focus for us is very much making those arrangements at the earliest possible opportunity. Identifying if somebody is vulnerable, and giving them advice and support. And that is much wider than just about paying their council tax debt. So the sort of things that we would be doing is identifying other debts that they have and making sure that we're referring them to those support agencies. We work very, very closely with the Citizens Advice Service, and we do a lot of referrals to them, and we work very, very proactively with those services. So it isn't a case of we hand them over to somebody. We will work, for example, if the Citizens Advice are working with a customer, we would work with the Citizens Advice and the customer together, very much a partnership approach. We actually do fund that independent advice service, so it's really important that the customer can access independent advice. Whilst we work in partnership with Citizens Advice, customers have the right to speak to the Citizens Advice and to deal confidentially with them. They may not be wanting to share all of the details of their debts with us, but that's why we have that independent advice service. One of the things that we will very often do is where we do identify somebody that has significant debt, and certainly for vulnerable customers, the very first thing we would do is you suspend any action. So if we were, for example, we had got an enforcement agent involved and we identified that that person was potentially vulnerable, we'd suspend recovery action, and we wouldn't even need to do that ourselves because our enforcement agents know that if they do identify anybody that's vulnerable, the first thing they do is they will refer that person back to their own vulnerable person support unit and suspend action. One of the other things we can do is review the costs. Sometimes we find out fairly late down the line that customer hasn't engaged with us and it's got right through the court process, they've had extra costs, and so we will always look at those and decide whether or not it's proportionate to actually charge those costs, and we can waive costs in appropriate circumstances. Isn't something that we would do as a matter of course, but certainly in exceptional situations we would absolutely be looking at that. And we do have the ability to consider some remit of the debt on the basis of exceptional hardship. Again, it's something that has a direct cost to the local authority. We pick the bill up for that, so we have to be careful in how we do that. But we do have a policy that covers exceptional hardship, and we do have some funds that have been made available through Essex County Council through the precept process to enable us to give that additional help to those customers that are suffering those exceptional hardship situations. So as we mentioned, vulnerable customers, it's really important for us to identify them at every stage, so whether they're talking to our customer services team, whether they're emailing, writing to us, we'll be looking for any triggers that might help identify that person is vulnerable. Within the strategy, it does set out very clearly there isn't a single definition, and we have looked at our definition of a vulnerable customer or our guidelines. And they're very much in line with most other local authorities. In fact, I think I'd probably go as far to say ours are probably more detailed than a lot of other authorities. So that gives the staff the discretion for themselves to identify if they consider somebody's vulnerable. We can, as we said, we can suspend action. That's now actually embedded in legislation called breathing space. But that's something that we have always done. So we haven't waited for the legislation to come in. We've always given customers that opportunity to have that, exactly what it says, a breathing space to be able to try and sort their situation out. The arrangements we make are appropriate for the circumstances. We need to obviously collect the debt in a reasonable period of time, but equally we have to be realistic about the customer circumstances, so we will always use the discretion to make an appropriate arrangement. Particularly if we make an arrangement that is longer than ideally we would like to repay the debt, we would insist that the customer does seek that additional support, because if they're not able to pay the debt back in a reasonable time, it means they have got significant debt issues. And we would normally get the customer's agreement to refer them through to some additional support through the Citizens Advice. You have some excellent dedicated officers that deal with specialist support for people who are in debt, so we would always do that. As I said earlier, we always look at not just the debt that that customer may owe to us, we actually have that holistic approach. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have the ability in exceptional hardship cases to review whether or not we are able to offer some sort of financial assistance through waiving all or part of the debt, and also through perhaps waiving some of the court costs. Thanks, Tara. So we mentioned that we have an independent advice service. So it isn't a service that the customers have to come to the council for, the same people that they owe the debt for. It's independent, and we procure that through a procurement process, and it's currently being delivered by Malden Citizens Advice. It's really important that the customer can see it is independent. It isn't somebody who works for the council giving them that advice. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of support that they are able to give, and the sort of things are debt advice, budgeting advice. So if someone's in debt, it's probably because they're not managing their budget, so it's no good just solving the current debt issue. It really needs that budget and support, so they're able to provide that. Part of that will be looking at their income, so can they maximise their income? Are they getting all the benefits they're entitled to? Are they paying an excessively high tariff for their fuel? It's a whole range of how can they maximise that person's income for them to try and help them get out of debt. They can also support people with benefit appeals. Probably one of the areas that's probably most in the newspapers is things like the personal independent payments for people that are disabled, where they suddenly find that they have a benefit that they have had for many years that's withdrawn. The Citizens Advice are absolute experts in terms of providing support with appeals. Apologies, members, because I should have the figures with me, but I believe it's something like over 90% success rate with the appeals they support customers with. Very, very high success rate. So very, very good. And as I mentioned, as well as providing that very independent service, independent of us, we also work very, very proactively with them, with the customers' agreement, and we do have regular liaison meetings with our debt recovery team, with the Citizens Advice, so we work very well alongside them. So as I mentioned, we have to be very, very careful with the powers that we're given, because they are quite extensive powers. So they're not used by any member of staff, they're only used by experienced and trained specialist staff. We only use enforcement powers where the customer has not engaged with us, or that all other methods that we've tried to engage with them have failed. And the most severe, which include the charging orders, bankruptcy, the actual removal of goods, and committal, have to be approved by senior staff. It's not something any of our staff would be able to do without a detailed analysis of the reasons, being able to justify it, and it being approved by a senior manager. I think one of the areas of concern was enforcement agents. So again, I think we just want to cover a little bit more detail on that. So we would only ever use an enforcement agent where the customers failed to engage with us, or where we have absolutely exhausted every other opportunity with them. Customers are always given an opportunity to reach a payment arrangement before the enforcement agents are instructed. So part of, once we get the court order, we will write to the customer and we'll give them that opportunity to engage with us. So we would never ever appoint an enforcement agent without giving the customer an opportunity. When we go through the end, I will go through the process with you, and you'll see just how many opportunities customers are given to make arrangements with us. It's about 5 or 6 before it would even get to this stage. We will always give our authority before we remove any goods from a customer. And as I'll mention at the very end, fortunately that happens extremely rarely. Most of the monies that are collected by our enforcement agencies are via having a payment arrangement with customers. So we keep very sort of tight reins on our enforcement agents. We have regular meetings with them, and we monitor them through a service level agreement review meeting. And we do have that regular liaison with them. And the enforcement agents, you can't just have anybody going in and doing this. All their actions are regulated. That includes the time of the day that they're allowed to attend premises, etc. So it is very much, they can't go and do what they want to do. It's very regulated. So the enforcement agents can make payment arrangements, and that is absolutely what our intention is that we would want our enforcement agents to actually collect this as a payment arrangement. Any vulnerable customers that they identify are referred to a completely separate team, and the enforcement is suspended. So as soon as they pick that up, we don't proceed until we've the enforcement agents have reviewed through the separate team, completely independent of the actual enforcement agents, whether that's appropriate to continue. And if the enforcement agents and their team have any concerns, they will always come back to us to take instructions. If we refer the case to an enforcement agent, there are some additional costs, but those costs are very minimal as long as the customer engages. So the first thing the enforcement agent will do is they will write to the customer and say, we've been asked to collect this council tax account from you. Please contact us to make a payment arrangement. The fees that are charged are set down in legislation, so again, the bailiffs can't decide, the enforcement agents can't decide what they want to charge, they are set down. One of the things that we require is that when the enforcement agents do attend, that they wear body-worn cameras, and goods are only removed from premises as an absolute last resort. We have had a few complaints previously, and we have been able to get that footage back from the enforcement agents, from their cameras, and we have been able to very satisfactorily go back and share with the customer, actually, this is what happened. Because I think sometimes people, it can be a very difficult situation, and sometimes what's said isn't perhaps what somebody's heard. So that having those body-worn cameras are really, really useful. Useful for the customer's protection as well as the enforcement agent. And the enforcement agents do have a formal complaint process, and that's something that we get advised about, and that's something we would take part in. So for some authorities, my experience has been that some authorities will say, sorry, you need to complain to the enforcement agent, that's nothing to do with us. We actually take the opposite view, so the enforcement agents have their own complaint process, but we will actively be part of that, so we will want to see the report, we will want to see the investigation, the evidence, what has been done to investigate this complaint, and we own that, because at the end of the day, we've instructed that enforcement agent to take that action, so it's very much our responsibility. During the pandemic, we have taken a slightly different approach. We understand that customers have been in a very difficult position. Many have been in a position where they have lost livelihoods, income, have had illness, so it's been very challenging for them. So during the period of the pandemic, we've taken a much more proportionate approach. So we have not been as rigorous in some of the action we've taken in terms of sending out reminders. We've allowed people to have a lot more time to repay debts. We've taken a lot less enforcement action. And we have been able to provide some additional financial support through the council tax support scheme that the government have provided some additional funding for. And that's been very much targeted at those that are on the lowest income. So that has been very, I think, helped an awful lot of people. So moving forward, whilst things are starting to become a little bit more normal, people are able to return to work. What we're very conscious of is a lot of the issues that customers have had, loss of income, etc. That's not going to go away overnight. The customers and residents are going to be having some of these financial impacts and emotional impacts for many years to come. So certainly during this year, we're continuing with that proportionate approach and giving customers more time to pay their debts. And we're also introducing some additional contacts before we start any enforcement action. So whereas customers might have had 5 or 6 contacts from us, we will be increasing those. So again, we're putting in those extra steps. And we've also making sure that there's more time before we take court action. Normally we would have taken court action much earlier in the year. Again, we're just giving customers a bit more breathing space, a bit more time before any court action is being taken this year. So the next slide, and I hope members can see the detail on that slide. I will talk you through it. And this is the data and the stats behind some of the things I've talked to you about. So the very first line is just to confirm that we do have between 27 to 28,000 properties. The data on here is based upon a range of dates, because what we didn't want to do is to give you just a 1 year snapshot, because that actually doesn't give you the reassurance that this is something that is embedded within our processes. So what we've done is we've looked at 2014 to 19, which is a good representative period prior to when COVID hit. So during that time, total properties between 27 and 28,000 properties that we were sending bills to. The council tax we collect is between, from sort of 2014, it was 35 million, 42.2 million in 2019. So as you can see, it's huge amounts of money that we have to collect. Our collection rate, which I apologise isn't on here, during that time was I think fairly significant. We've got most years was in excess of 98%, so it's between 98.1 to 98.3, and I think the best year was 93.6. So 98.6. So we are collecting more than 98% of our council tax every year, which nationally is on a par with sort of national collection rates. And across Essex, ours is actually quite good as well. One of the things that we're very, very keen to do is to try to get our residents to sign up to direct debit, because it's so much easier for them to budget. And customers that are on direct debit and having those regular payments are far less likely to fall into arrears and get into a position of getting into enforcement action. So we've had quite a targeted approach to that and really encouraged the take-up. So over those 5 years, we've increased the direct debit take-up from 68% up to nearly 73%, and that's something that we continue to encourage customers to do. In the course of a year, we issue somewhere between 51,000 to sort of 52,500 bills a year. And then the next figures underneath that are the percentage of those bills that then go on to have reminders, enforcement action. And as you'll see, it's a decreasing figure. So from the customers or residents that are sent bills, about 13% of those end up with getting a reminder. At that point, when they get the reminders, we do an awful lot of work to get those people onto payment arrangements and avoid further action. If they don't make those arrangements, or they make them and they fall behind, they will get what's called a final notice, which is a kind of a prerequisite to enforcement action. About somewhere around about 5% of our of the bills we send out end up with a final notice. So you can see there's quite a steep reduction in those that start off with getting a reminder and then go further. So of that 5%, roughly about 3% of those then go on to receive a summons. When the customers receive a summons, we do get quite a lot of payment at that stage. So when it goes to court and we get the liability orders, we're talking about 2% of our original bill debts actually getting to a summons stage. Once we get the liability order, all those residents will get a letter asking about details of their income and expenditure, and asking them to engage with us to make a payment arrangement. And every single resident will get, as a minimum, one of those letters. If we go into taking some action, so we're going to go into an arrangement and that arrangement fails, we would send out another information request to find out about what their revised circumstances are. So as a minimum, the residents would always get one of those opportunities, but more frequently you would get probably 2 or 3 of those. Once we've got the liability orders, for those people that don't enter into payment arrangements with us, we've then got the attachment orders, so the attachment of earnings orders. So between 0.2 and 0.4% of our debts end up on attachment orders. That's not always such a bad thing, because some of our residents actually quite like that actually coming out of their pay and knowing that that's deducted at source if they're struggling. But it is still a relatively small number. Again, people who are in receipt of benefits, we can do attachment of benefit order. So a small amount is taken out of their benefits. Again, quite often customers like that because it helps them budget. What we then come down to is when we then get to an enforcement agent stage. So if we've explored all the opportunities to try and enter an arrangement, to do an attachment order, we then would then look at some form of enforcement action and sending those cases to an enforcement agent. Apologies members, there's one that I've missed there, which is attachment of members allowance, which we have, in the last 5 years, we have had a couple of cases where we have put attachment on members allowances, but that, as you can see, as a proportion is a very, very tiny percentage. So enforcement agents, we get between sort of 2–2.5% of the cases end up with an enforcement agent. But as I said, the purpose of that is really just to continue to negotiate those payment arrangements. So cases that go to an enforcement agent generally get paid at the rate of sort of 50 to 55% of what gets referred to them gets collected by an enforcement agent. And anything up to 50% get paid at that very first stage where an enforcement agent doesn't ever go to a property. It's done via letter. If it does get to a stage of the customers aren't engaging and it does get to an enforcement stage, that's where the enforcement agents will actually go to the property and talk to the customer about the debt and try to negotiate a payment arrangement. Of those, between 50 to 66% are paid at that stage where the enforcement agent will actually visit the property. The thing that I think members are probably most concerned about is how many actually do we then remove the goods for. In the last 5 years, we've had 2 cases in 5 years where we've removed goods. And we would only do that where there were absolutely justifiable reasons for doing that, and it would only be authorised by, again, a senior officer.
Can I just interrupt, just to reinforce that point, members? 2 people within 5 years, and I just think that's something we really need to shout about and congratulate ourselves for, because if you look at the national average being 1%, we've done way, way better than that. So I'll let Mrs Green continue now, but I think that's really important we take that on board.
From our perspective, we see that as a success because we are minimising the numbers of customers that are being subjected to those more severe enforcement actions, so absolutely. On the very final slide, what we've done is to again give you those numbers, because we're giving you the percentages because I think that helps show from when we send the bills the percentage of people that we engage with and how that gradually reduces as we go further down the enforcement process. So to put some sort of actual numbers on that, we've given you them there. So we've got reminders. We roughly send out sort of 7,000 reminders a year. There's about 2,500 final notices. Somewhere around sort of 1,500 to 2,000 summonses, which ends up with numbers of liability orders just being just over 1,000. So we do send out the letters requesting additional information about the customer's details, income and expenditure to every single person that we take action through the courts on. And there, the attachment of earnings and benefit orders are in there, sort of between 100 to sort of 250 a year. Members' attachment of allowances, as I mentioned, it's 2 over 5 years. And the rest, I think, are percentages there, apart from the removal of goods, which is, as I said, two customers in 5 years. So I hope that's been helpful, members. I hope that's given you the reassurance I think that you were seeking in terms of our approach. I'm very proud of our team. They are very dedicated, very customer focused, and if I say it myself, they do an absolutely fantastic job, and I'm very, very proud of what they achieve. Happy to take questions, members.
Thank you very much, and we're very, very happy. I think I can speak for all members to say that we are very, very, very proud of you and your team. So, and thank you. I realise a lot of work went into this, and I'd really like to thank you for that. Also acknowledge the pressures that your team have been under for the last year as well. And just members, this is something we need to be shouting about. This is something we're doing really, really well. So I'd like to thank Councillor Morris in his absence for bringing this item, because it's given us an opportunity to shout about something that we do very, very well as a council, I think. So thank you. I will go to Councillor Skeens, please.
Yes, shouting about it. Fantastic work, really well done. But could it be counterproductive to actually shout loudly about only 2 people being prosecuted, since, I mean, I just sometimes wonder whether that might encourage people to think, oh, probably get away with this, could really push it. I'm just wondering whether that's the sort of thing that we can successfully shout about, and whether it might be counterproductive.
I think the point is that our systems are so effective that actually people don't get to that stage, and that the support we give to people is over and above that they would receive from other authorities, that enables people not to get in debt.
Yes, through you, Chair, yes, I think those are good messages, but I'm just alerting you to the potential danger of how we might shout about a success like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members like to speak? Councillor Mays.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair.
You listed me again.
I know I
didn't
did.
you?
No, I corrected myself. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms Green. Absolutely brilliant, well talked through. I think everything was very clear. Just one very small thing that I wanted to ask, which was regarding the attachments of earnings, and you referred to attachments of benefits and attachments of members' allowance. I wasn't quite clear at what point those come into play, and whether or not they could come into play a bit earlier on in the system, so that we can actually then reduce the numbers even further than they already are. And I'm very impressed with the numbers that as they stand at the moment.
I believe that's governed by legislation, isn't it? Or is it?
It is, members. It's only when you get the liability order that enables us to make those deductions. There's nothing to stop a resident, if they want to approach their employer to make those voluntary deductions, but in terms of us being able to ask the employer to do it, unfortunately it is only at that later stage once we've actually got a liability order.
Thank you. Yeah.
Could I just come back on that so that I completely understand the system? So if somebody says to one of your staff that that's something that they would welcome, can you go down that process and help them actually enable that to happen? Or is that something you would then pass on to Citizens Advice Bureau, where we procure a lot of our support from? Thank you.
So if a resident wants us to do an attachment order, we can do it, but it is only at those later enforcement stages. We can't do it ahead of the liability order being granted by the court. So if somebody was struggling and perhaps needed some help with budgeting, absolutely, that's where we would involve the Citizens Advice.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councillor Stone.
Thank you. No questions, but just like to say, oh, sorry, I'm going to give way because the councillor is on this committee.
Councillor Passenger and Beale now. Everyone's jumping in now, so I will go to you, Councillor Passenger, then Councillor Beale.
Thank you very
Then
much.
back
And
to
thank you
Councillor
very much,
Stamp.
Councillor Stamp. Just one sort of a thing, really. So the way it kind of looks to me is that if there is a vulnerable person, we do everything possible we can before we send in the agency, the enforcement agency. Is that sort of...
That's absolutely correct.
So at what point do the enforcement agency then spot a vulnerable person if we already haven't done that?
It's generally where the resident hasn't engaged with us at all. So where they've had the letters, they've had the notices, we might have tried to phone them, and they've ignored all of that. And sometimes an enforcement agent turning up on the door is the first time we actually get to understand that that person might have mental health problems, or might be unwell, might be elderly, and quite often that's what happens, is that it's that face-to-face when they actually see somebody for the first time. Because unfortunately, if people are in debt, one of the things we find is people just ignore it and hope it will go away.
Just to come back, if I may. I mean, I'm not trying to knock the system, but it just seems to me that enforcement agencies are not really the most touchy-feely people in the world, and I think when it gets to the point when the enforcement agency actually go there, for instance, I mean, how do they get paid? Are they paid on commission, or are we paying them? How does that work?
The legislation sets out a fee that is charged to the resident. So there's a set amount that the enforcement agents can collect as part of the debt. So it isn't an open-ended, there is a set amount that they are able to charge.
So again, so no collection, no pay, basically.
That's correct.
So it just seems, I mean, it just seems that our duty of care really should really make sure that we spot the vulnerable person before the enforcement agent goes in, because my way of thinking, cynical as it is, I know, that if an agency sends in people to vulnerable people to collect debt, they're very unlikely to be looking to be picking up whether or not they're vulnerable or not. They're more interested in picking up their debt, I would have thought.
If I can just interject there, I mean, how you spot someone that completely refuses to engage, I really don't understand, Councillor Bassinger, but I'm reassured by the fact that the enforcement agents do have a vulnerable person referral system themselves. I mean, they're clearly used to dealing with vulnerable people because that's what they do, and I know there is a very negative stereotype around enforcement agents, but I don't think we particularly want to go down the road of negative stereotypes, really.
No.
No, it's not ideal, but I don't see how our system can be any more robust than it is. I don't know if you'd like to come back again on that, Mrs. Green.
Madam Chair, I just say, I mean, I totally agree with you, but I mean, we're looking at this from sort of, you know, in a perfect world that it all works perfectly, and I just think there is a huge gap. And I mean, the figures justify there isn't that many people, thank goodness, but it does worry me rather that, you know, we're leaving it to the enforcement agency at the last post to actually decide whether or not somebody is vulnerable or not, when actually there's money involved.
We're not, Councillor Bassinger, I think is the answer to that.
I'm sorry?
We're not, only in the most extreme circumstances where a person has absolutely refused to engage with us. That's the only point, I think, Mrs. Green. If we've had absolutely no engagement from a resident, would they not be picked up as vulnerable? Am I right in?
That's absolutely right. So we would use multiple forms as well. So we would look at, if we've got a telephone number, an email, by post, we would do every form of communication we could to try and ensure that we do pick up anybody that we think is vulnerable. We also work very closely with our colleagues, for example, in the housing team, because that person may well be claiming benefits, might well have housing issues. So again, where appropriate, we will try to identify vulnerability from any other records that we have as well.
So do we have an officer or something, sort of an in-between person before the agency actually go in? So I know we're sort of sending letters and phone calls, and you know, I just think, you know, when people are very vulnerable, it's, you know, they fall through, you know, they go through the net, and sometimes, you know, I mean, it's, you know, I do understand what you're doing, but I just wondered if we had an officer or somebody that goes and actually knocks on the door before we send in the heavy brigade and tries to establish what's going on.
We don't, and if I'm honest, I'm not sure that sending somebody from the council to them in a lot of cases would make a lot of difference, because they're not engaging with us anyway. And the number of people that are vulnerable are relatively small as well. So I think, you know, it's not all of the people that enforcement agents deal with. It is a minority, but absolutely it's important that, you know, we protect that minority. So we do absolutely everything that we can. And in, as I said, if it gets to the stage of an enforcement agent knocking on the door and they identify that there is someone that's vulnerable, they walk away. They don't deal with it anymore. They pass it to a separate team. They're completely independent. They're not part of the actual team that go out and collect debts. They're totally independent. And they would always refer back to us in terms of, we've been to this property, we've come across somebody who we think might have some mental health issues. We think they probably need some extra support. What do you want us to do? And we will quite often say either suspend action or send the case back to us. We'll get the citizens' advice involved. We will make that contact. So it's absolutely looking at every opportunity. As soon as there's a chink there that we have concerns, absolutely enforcement action suspended, and we will give that opportunity to make sure we understand that's the situation before we take any further action.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mayes, I believe.
Thank you. Can you, oh, I'm sorry. Actually, Councillor Beale was.
Councillor
did
Beale,
put
I'm
his
sorry,
hand
you
up for me. Thank you.
Councillor Beale and then Councillor Mayes.
Just about 3 points. What about debts that are created within another district? How do we cover that situation for collection when they're in our district? Also, what happens when a person dies of natural causes? And also, who is the officer at Moore District Council, or what committee is it, that will resolve the matter by eliminating that debt?
Something to test you, Mrs. Green.
Right, so the local authority where the debt was incurred will be responsible for collecting that debt. So there's never a suggestion that the debts will be passed on to another local authority. So if somebody lived in Colchester and owed Colchester £500, they came here and owed us £1,500, they would still have to pay that original £500 back to Colchester, and it would be up to Colchester to take action in respect of that debt. So is that okay for the first one? The second one, if somebody does die, it kind of depends on whether or not they leave any estate. So we would send, an account would be sent to the executors of the estate when that person has died, and we would register our interest, and it would depend on whether there was any money in the estate as to whether or not the debt was paid. If there wasn't any money in the estate, then we can write that debt off. And that's exactly what we do if there is no possible ability to recover the debt. It depends on the amount of the debt. If it's a relatively small amount, then officers have got delegated powers to write those debts off. The larger debts have to be signed off by a senior officer, and the really large debts, which I believe is over 10,000, come back to members, and they have to be written off through the Strategy and Resources Committee.
Could I come back and ask a further question, please? What happens if a person absconds and goes abroad and say you can't collect the money in this country? Do we hold that debt open until a person returns, or do we write it off?
We try to avoid ever writing debts off, because there will be times when people might abscond, but sometimes they come back. So absolutely we would not necessarily write a debt off, and we would use every power that we have to be able to trace them. So we do have access to certain government systems. We share information with other local authorities, so we have lots of data matching with other authorities. And there's some national data matching as well. So again, we use every power that we can to identify where we have got people that have got debts. And we would absolutely do everything we can to recover those.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor Mayes now, please.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Green, could you give me some idea as to what sort of training and support that you give our staff on identifying vulnerable residents that may find themselves in debt, and is that ongoing training? Thank you.
It absolutely is. So all of the staff that come to us ideally comes with some previous experience of dealing with debts. If they don't, then we absolutely will give them a lot of training. A lot of it is with our other experienced officers, so we'll be working alongside them, and they will only be given very small remits to do things. So to start with, they might be able to negotiate payment arrangements, and once they become more experienced, we'll let them then undertake other forms of enforcement. So never ever will we put somebody who is not fully experienced to be able to do the full gambit of recovery action. And again, we're very proud of the way that we support our staff and the training that we give them. And we have got a number of our staff across the Revenues and Benefits Service that are professionally trained with IRRV qualifications, which we've supported them to do.
Could I come back and ask one more question?
You could, then Councillor Huebner, then Councillor Bassinger.
Thank you. You said that we're a you said that we're a collection agency. which we are. We collect some big figure, I seem to remember, I wrote down somewhere, several million. If we don't collect that money, let's say we only collect 30 million instead of 40 million, are we still paying out the percentage that we need to all the other agencies, and we then have to retain that debt going forward?
Absolutely. However well we do with our collection rates, we are ultimately the ones that will be financially affected. So we only benefit from around about 12-13% of the overall amount that we collect. But whether we collect the debt or not, we still have to pay Essex County Council their 70% or however much it is. So yes, absolutely, we fully meet the cost of any non-collection.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Hubner. Then Councillor Messenger. Am I pronouncing you right, Councillor?
Yes, you are.
Good, thank you.
Yes, my question has just been answered there, where if we don't get the money in, what percentage of that is then collected and how do we do it? Yes. That's right, so.
Yes, so you're good with that. Thank you. Councillor Messenger.
Sorry, just to go back to the thing of vulnerability, it seems to me, I mean, you've explained it all very well, and I take all of that on board, but it just seems as though, there's like an agency knocks on the door and they are, surprised there is a vulnerable person, where we've had a huge history with this person. We've tried to engage with them, we've sent them letters. So how is it that we haven't already spotted that they are vulnerable?
As I mentioned earlier, it's generally where that customer has not engaged in any way, shape or form with us, so we've got no idea that they are vulnerable. And that's the issue. I think that the cases that we have had where we've identified vulnerability at a later stage is absolutely 100% where that customer has not engaged with us and we've had no way of knowing that they are vulnerable. And as I mentioned earlier, we will use all the means at our disposal to try and identify if we do have a vulnerable person. And even if there's a suspicion that person is vulnerable, but if we have absolutely no idea that they are, unfortunately there are occasions when it is later down the line we discover they're vulnerable. But if that happens, as I say, our position is that we don't proceed on that basis, that as soon as we know they're vulnerable, then we absolutely take a different approach.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Skiggins, please.
Yes, on the question of vulnerability, do you, I know I'm taking Councillor Bashford's point that perhaps the best person to spot vulnerability is not, it might not be a bailiff. I understand, of course, there would be cost implications of employing someone to do a pre-check on people who aren't responding to see if they're vulnerable or not. If they're not responding, is there an agency that you can speak to, a voluntary agency, some people who provide care in the community who could check for you? Is there a means by which we can try, since you say that sending a council officer around wouldn't work, is there a sort of a cost-effective halfway house between complete silence and the bailiff turning up at the door? Is that something that is possible or considered or done?
Are we governed by legislation here, Mrs. Green?
No, members, if members felt that that was something, that an additional step that they would like to be put into the process, absolutely, it's something we could do. That would be the numbers of cases that go to an enforcement agent. That would be a fairly big undertaking, but certainly if you wanted us to look at that, it's certainly something we could do. The only thing I would say is that the numbers of people that are identified as vulnerable are very, very small compared with the overall numbers. So proportionally, the resource that would go into identifying a relatively small number of vulnerable people is something that would need to be carefully considered. But absolutely, it's something that we could do.
Thank you. Now, as just going to check, I believe, Mrs. Green, that one suggestion you had was because I believe the corporate debt strategy is being reviewed at the moment, and I believe that one of your suggestions was that that would come to members. So I'm just thinking maybe this is something that could be discussed in that process. if we make that recommendation?
Absolutely. So the corporate debt strategy is nearly 4 years old. So we have got some updates to do to it in terms of some of the changes that have happened with the legislation. So we're planning to bring that back to members next year in terms of an update. So what members could do is any recommendations that came out of this scrutiny review could be fed in as part of that reconsideration of the corporate debt strategy, and that's absolutely the suggestion from Councillor Bassinger of putting in that extra step is something that members may want to consider.
Councillor Mays, then Councillor Bassinger.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I also think that we need to make the process much more visible online.
We do.
And I think this is also going to be looked at.
It's a recommendation, Councillor Mays. It
yeah,
will be.
Yeah, the website is definitely somewhere. You know, if somebody decides that they want to tackle their debt, they ask Mr. Google and they want an answer. You know, they don't want to have to be searching around too much for the information that they need. And I do think that is quite an important recommendation going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bassinger, I believe you wanted to come back.
I was just wondering again, is there any way that people, I presume we sort of keep records of people that are elderly or disabled and all these things, we have all this stuff. But is there any way that people could actually register themselves as being or feeling that they're vulnerable, whether it's financially, it could be one parent family, or where they could actually put themselves, if they wanted to, on that register to be considered by council? So as, for instance, just going forward, so if they felt themselves coming into difficulty or falling on hard times or whatever their vulnerability is, they could actually register themselves so as we do have a record of people who are willing to be recognised as vulnerable. Is that?
I would suggest that's a very dangerous road
is that
to
a stupid
go
thing
down,
to say? It probably
Passenger,
is.
But
I think if the customer has come forward to recognise they have a vulnerability, we would be picking that up anyway now because they've made that contact. The problem is that people aren't making that contact with us. And also vulnerability is sometimes a perception, sometimes it's a temporary thing, sometimes it's longer term. So I think it is quite difficult, but absolutely if somebody said anything to us that gave us concerns that they were vulnerable, we would take that step at that point of treating them as potentially vulnerable and putting the extra controls in place.
and also that person would be engaging. If they were registering themselves, then they would be engaging with the council, and therefore they wouldn't fit into the subgroup of people that are getting a first contact from the bailiffs. Councillor Stan.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm really interested in the figures. I mean, it's great what Councillor Bassinger's suggesting, and I'm all for if we can actually support anybody who is vulnerable, but we also need to know the figures, because normally within our society and our communities, somebody is aware of somebody who may be vulnerable, or the CVS is. There's often some services, you know, that you could raise the query with yourself, and as long as there's a confidential avenue, I've done it myself where I've gone in somewhere and I've thought, oh my goodness me, and then you would contact somebody, and 9 times out of 10 you could be incorrect, Madam Chair. But I totally agree, and if we can look at it and it can be adapted, but I'd like to know the figures and the numbers of people we're actually talking about. And really, 1 is too many, 2 is definitely too many, because they are the most vulnerable. But we've also got to be realistic, and if that can be brought in with confidentiality, etc., I think we should do it. But can I just say, Madam Chair, that I know that these 2 items that have been brought to this committee tonight were delayed or deferred from a previous meeting, but I'd like to say that the officers who presented tonight, it was well worth the wait, because I would think a lot of us didn't know, and I know you said how much hard work, and I know the other members have as well, we didn't know half of what has been explained to us today, and that's not just because we're newly elected members, it's because we're actually going into the responsibilities of the officers. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody in this council, for both of you and your team behind you has done this information, because a lot of hard work's gone into that. I said, and that's a lot of years' information, Ms Green, so thank you. But I totally agree with Councillor Bassinger, and if there is anything we can do, then I think it should come back to either this committee or the council in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stamp. I do just want to clarify that there's no suggestion that those two people that had goods removed were vulnerable.
No, I'm well aware of that. I didn't infer they were, did I? But
You
yeah.
didn't, Councillor Stamp.
thank
Just
you.
to clarify in case
Yeah.
members listening or...
Well, I can't
whatever,
always
remember
interpret how
that.
people interpret what I say, Councillor Bell, and I think you'll agree with that.
If we could, Councillor Stamp, we'd probably be earning millions of pounds somewhere else rather than being here. Okay, members, well, I would like to propose that we do look at, when this comes back, that we do investigate the potential for an additional step just to ensure that we are doing everything we can. I would like to propose that the website is updated to make it much easier to find information about debt. I mean, I'll be looking at just a button on the homepage that you hit and it takes you to. My understanding is that currently you have to look at corporate debt policies to find or strategies to find the information. So my recommendation is those two. Originally I was going to request that a working group report back to PG&A, but I'm not sure, because of the low numbers, I'm not sure we actually need that, but I'm happy to adopt that if members think. Councillor Mays, I think you wanted to speak.
Yeah, I was just going to come back on the website thing. It needs to be in really plain English. You know, please avoid any jargon. Make it easy for everybody, young and old alike, to understand. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I mean, do we think we need a working group to report to PG&A? What do we think about that, members? No? In which case, I'm proposing that with those two provisos, that we look at the website, update the website, and we investigate the feasibility of an additional step as part of the review of the corporate debt strategy, that we then close this item. Members, do I have a seconder? Councillor Mays, Councillor Skeens. Members, can we agree that by assent? Agreed. Thank you, and thanks again, just to echo what Councillor Stamp said, thank you very much for that. It was extremely helpful and illuminating, so thank you. Okay, agenda item 10, any other items of business that the Chairman decides are urgent? You'll be very relieved to know, members, that there are none. So, thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions this evening. And I now draw the meeting to a close at 9:25 p.m. Thank you very much. And the meeting is now closed. Members are advised not to enter into any further discussion.